We're here at Symbol 7, and we're trying to understand how it is that the mind achieves its form. And within its structure, there are forms that are called ideas, which are extremely objective, and we're trying to appreciate that they do not get there by anything being tinkered together. The forms of ideas in the mind emerge out of experience. And so it is a parallel of the way in which existential things emerge out of nature. And there is a classic misunderstanding that has come in for the past couple of thousand years, and unfortunately lodges itself into the schools, lodges itself into the written books upon which schools base themselves. And so it's like a pernicious, erroneous assumption that continues from age to age, from country to country, from population to population. And all along that concourse, there have been men and women, individually, in small groups, who pause and say, wait a minute, this is not the way it happens for me. Something else is going on here. The difficulty came about 2,500 years ago when there was a shift from the emphasis that our sense of nature was the world to the shift that our world is the mind in town, in the city. When cities became large enough and minds became complex enough, they literally forgot their natural bearings. In our time, in the 20th century, we were nearly drowned by doctrines that were totally just mentally based and had nothing to do with nature. The Nazis, the communists, all the isms, one can go on. They have the same ability that thought has naturally, that is to take its structure and project it into the world. And so doctrines, the isms, work exactly the same way, but in a detrimental effect that symbols would work in a natural way. One of the watersheds in this came towards the end of the 1960s, the beginning of the 1970s. By that time, it was apparent that there was a huge split going on. There were people for whom the mind had to be tightened up in terms of detail, in terms of elementary parts and particles that were arranged logically and clearly, and that this is what controls the world. An arranged and ordered symbolic mind, completely illogical. The other camp were people who, from various different angles, rejected this, criticized it, but their critiques fell on deaf ears because almost all of the array of the opposition was finally lumped under mysticism. These people are talking about dreams, they're talking about mystical experiences, they're talking about metaphysics, they're not talking about the real practical world. The focus of that practical world of logic was a very severe logician who became the most famous philosopher of the 20th century. His name is Wittgenstein. And in one of the books that we're taking a cursory look at, Philosophy in a New Key by Suzanne K. Langer, her whole 4th chapter is on Wittgenstein. And she says the logical theory on which this whole study of symbols is based is essentially that which was set forth by Wittgenstein some 20 years ago. And then she names his book, and the book has a very strong Latin title, Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. The name itself tells you how severely dry this is. Wittgenstein himself was a weird character. Not just extraordinary, but he was weird. Wittgenstein's father was one of the richest men in Europe. His father, Karl, who went through all kinds of odd adventures as a young man. He was from a Jewish family that converted to Protestantism because they didn't want to have social problems. And he, very unlike young Jewish boys, not only ran away from home when he was a young teenager, but he ran away all the way to America. And had a hard time supporting himself, but he got the courage that he got the American way, the 19th century American way from like post-Civil War days, that if you want to, you can make money. But if you want to make money, you should make it big. So choose something that is going to be necessary in the future, focus on that, get a monopoly on it, and then hang on to that. So when he came back to Austria, came back to Vienna, after a couple of years of roughing it in the American industrial genius land, he focused on steel making. Whatever they're going to make in the future, no matter what it is, they're going to need steel. So he started buying up shares in nascent steel companies, and then investing also in one of the biggest industries that was using steel, railroads. So he had steel mills and railroads, and Karl Wittgenstein became one of the richest men in Europe. He was a big, burly sort of a guy, but he loved elegance, and he said, I can afford it. So he built one of the most grand homes in Vienna. And because he wanted his children to be economically royal, all of his children were developed to become little geniuses and very cultivated. And one of his sons, Ludwig, when he was younger, was exactly that pristine prig that his father was so proud that his children had all the good manners, they had all the good background, all the good education, and they had the American know-how that if they wanted to get to something, they had the dedication to go and do it. So when Ludwig Wittgenstein was still an older boy, he got fascinated about the new product that was coming out, sewing machines. So he wanted to know how sewing machines worked, and he had this incredible detailed relentlessness that he carved out of wood all of the parts of a sewing machine and made a sewing machine out of wooden parts that actually could sew. So he was that kind of a brilliant character. And in the home life, because they were what used to be called nouveau riche, they were not royalty at all. They hadn't been rich for a long time. But they wanted to have events in their home that they could appreciate. And so they decided, Carl Wittgenstein decided that music was a good thing because you could just listen to it. And if you got the best musicians coming to your house to play little concerts and chamber things and teach the children, then you would be okay. And so the Wittgenstein House in Vienna became the center of later 19th century classical music. That people like Johannes Brahms, like Gustav Mahler, Schoenberg, the whole crowd showed up at the Wittgensteins on a regular basis at their parties, to teach the children. And so Ludwig Wittgenstein grew up having both the capacity to understand great music and also this relentless, detailed quality of going after things. He majored in aeronautical engineering, a technical school in Berlin, and he did so well. He was so engineeringly specific that they said, you need to go to one of the best technical universities in the world at the turn of the 20th century, and that was in Manchester, England. Manchester is the industrial center of England. And so he majored in aeronautical engineering. And while he was there, he suddenly got interested in the procedures of logical thought. And so he thought, I will write a little outline, like an engineering outline of the aeronautical design of thought of how it works. And so he wrote a little sketch that developed into a number of pages, and then because he came from one of these very wealthy Viennese families, he had this style that he would find who is the best logical teacher in Europe, and I'm going to go and show him my thing. Of course, he'll see me, I'm a Wittgenstein. And so he found the top European logician at the time. He was an older man. His name was Frege. And Frege's logical writings have become classics in the field now. Extremely difficult to understand, a kind of a mathematical logic to the nth degree. When he saw the character of Wittgenstein and the incredible detail that he put into this, he said, I'm not the master of logic in the world. The master of logic in the world is in England. He's at Cambridge University. His name is Bertrand Russell. You can only go so far with me, but Bertrand Russell is the top man in the world, and maybe for all time, in specificity of how logic links to mathematics. And so Wittgenstein, being a Wittgenstein, visited Cambridge and right away got an audience with Bertrand Russell. And the thing to remember about Bertrand Russell is that he was Lord Russell. He was a peer of the realm. He wasn't an ordinary man. He was royal. And Lord Russell was also the sharpest intellectual genius at Cambridge. And this is the Cambridge of about 1910, 1911. About 10 years before he had paired up with one of the great philosophers of all time, Alfred North Whitehead, who was one of the teachers of Suzanne Langer. And Russell and Whitehead had written a 3-volume huge work called Principia Mathematica. And it was called Principia Mathematica because it claimed to do what Isaac Newton's Principia had done several hundred years before for physics. And Newton had also been at Cambridge. And so this Cambridge tradition that we have people every so often who write the greatest books in the world, and that Principia Mathematica was so difficult to master, hundreds and hundreds, over 1,000 pages of detailed, logical, semi-mathematical script that they had to put out a little introduction to it, which was just the first 56 sections, that even that is almost impossible to read. It's like an encoded thing that is relentless. Wittgenstein took to it like a duck to water. And when he showed his logical work to Russell, Russell said, you must become a philosopher. You're going to become one of the greatest logicians of all time. And this is the place for you to do it. I'm the man who can mentor you and see that all this gets done. So Wittgenstein, who was extremely phobic about many things, he didn't like people to touch him. He was like the Bill Murray character in the film What About Bob? He was very careful about everything. He never married. He decided that what he needed was to get himself completely abstracted from the Europe that he knew, and because he had money, had incredible amounts of money. He went to a place in Norway, just outside of Bergen, Norway, in one of those wild fjords, and he built himself a little cabin, like a log cabin. And he was there with a friend of his named David Pinsett, who was a very nervous British intellectual. And Wittgenstein spent month after month patiently writing out his book on logic. It was thought to have been lost, and it was found in 1965 and published finally. And it is called, because it's the manuscript before the Tractatus, it's called the Proto-Tractatus. And when he was finished writing it, he assumed that everybody in the world would immediately understand that this was the greatest thing that had ever been done. So he asked Lord Russell to write an introduction to it, and because Russell could read it, he wrote a fabulous introduction to it saying, this is one of the watersheds of human thought. This may be the greatest single book on logic since mine. And mine is the greatest single book on logic for the last 300 years. But nobody wanted to publish it. Nobody wanted to touch it. There's no market for it. Who can read this? So Wittgenstein got into a huff that, well, to hell with you then. And just at that time, the First World War broke out. And to challenge himself to see if he was manly enough to brave the world like his father had braved the world, he joined the military. And he kept bucking to get into more and more dangerous assignments. Unlike guys that tried to get comfortable, Wittgenstein kept pushing to get himself to the front, get himself to the trenches, get himself involved to find out what he was made out of. And he was decorated for gallantry and bravery several times. And then finally, towards the end, what turned out to be the end of World War I, he was captured in Italy. And he was put into a concentration camp as a German soldier. And while he was there in that concentration camp, they allowed him to correspond with Bertrand Russell. And he said to Russell, why don't you get my book published? Find some way to do this. And eventually, a man in Germany whose publication was running out, it was an annual of Philosophic Review, took the unedited, unrefined version of the Tractatus and published it without proofreading it, without anybody understanding, and all kinds of errors were in it. And finally, later on, when Wittgenstein saw a copy, he said, well, these are just pirates. But in the meantime, Russell realized that there was a guy who could understand Wittgenstein, a young guy on the campus at Cambridge, who was very much like Wittgenstein's father, he was not only a genius and courageous, but he was making incredible amounts of money, and his name was C.K. Ogden. One of his great triumphs is a book called On Symbols, called The Meaning of Meaning, that he wrote with I.A. Richards, who also went to Cambridge in 1911, about the same time. You have to understand there was a generation of genius. Sri Aurobindo was just going there. I.A. Richards, C.K. Ogden, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Whitehead, Russell, G.E. Moore. I mean, on and on. Everywhere in Cambridge, there was like this refined intelligence that was called the blossoming of the greatest intelligence since the time of Sir Isaac Newton. But their intelligence was not intuitive. Their intelligence was specific detail. Let's get the engineering design of how the mind works, how language works, so that we never again will have to be unclear about anything. And the center of it was the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, translated into English by C.K. Ogden. And Ogden was brilliant enough. He knew English in a refined way enough, even though he was still only in his 20s, that his translation of the Tractatus suddenly brought it out so that there were enough people who could read it who realized that this was a work of genius, including Wittgenstein himself. And his correspondence with C.K. Ogden has been published because Ogden was so brilliant. He was like Wittgenstein. He would ask him, do you mean to say this in German, that it is said this way then in English? And by this time, Wittgenstein, was deep enough into English that he could understand the intricacies of English. So he and Ogden together completely revised and tightened up the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. And when it was published in 1922, it blew out the philosophical world. Everyone realized that this was a work of such extraordinary genius, but they didn't know how you were going to be able to utilize this, because it begins as if it is a tractate on logic, which it is. But as you go through it, more and more, what occurs to you is that Wittgenstein is showing that the structure of logic in the mind comes to dead ends. That it is finite. It is formed, indeed. It has a tremendous complexity. But the complexity comes to a completeness of form, and that's it. It doesn't budge one iota beyond that. So that it produces the sense that there's obviously a kind of a lurking claustrophobia in intelligence, because that's how the mind is structured. Well, then what the hell are we going to do? If we do get really refined in intelligence so that we understand very clearly what we're doing, we will understand very clearly that we have limits that cannot be gone beyond. And that leaves us in an abstract limbo. So that the very last sentence of the Tractatus, every sentence is numbered. It goes up to 6.54, and then the very last sentence is number 7, and it reads like this: whereof one cannot speak, therefore one must be silent. So the greatest logical treatise in the world ends by saying the mind is this and only this, and beyond that, there's nothing we can say, there's only silence. Now, this was an extraordinary blow. But there were people like Alfred North Whitehead who, unlike Lord Russell, really didn't care for Wittgenstein. For one thing, one of Whitehead's sons was killed in the First World War, and he didn't like anybody speaking German. And Whitehead later on got completely fed up with Europe and moved to the United States. He moved to Harvard, where he was the great philosophic professor at Harvard. And in order for him to overcome this kind of logical constriction, he said symbols definitely are related not just to a structure, but they're related to a process. And so he wrote a huge book called Process and Reality, very complex, trying to flesh out that the process is as complex as the form, and that when you take the process and the form together, there is a very interesting ecology that comes out of it. And it turns out that this is actually the case. It is true. Whitehead says that the process of experience becomes so complexly nourished and enriched that that's what the mind is, that it emerges out of it, much like a crystal would precipitate out of a very thick solution. And that if you bring a solution to a certain threshold of complexity, the mind will crystallize naturally out of that enriched experience. So that the whole point of making a better mind is to increase your experience, the richness of your experience, the depth of the way in which your feelings and your images and your oral language of capacities are raised to an ever higher level. And then in order to change the form of the mind, because the mind by itself doesn't transform, the mind, though, can be reabsorbed back into the process and then reprecipitated out. And Whitehead says this is an experience where we learn to let ourselves go back into the enriched experience and then re-emerge out of that enriched experience as a reformed person, as a reformed mind. We have a new mind, or a new form of the mind, or like new clothing on the mind. Now it becomes much more capable, much nicer. And he says that this experience, being the solution for the old mind and then the new mind to come out of an enriched experience, is very parallel to the way in which nature itself is the process out of which existence precipitates and comes into being. And the way in which existential things improve themselves in nature, which they evolve, is that they are reabsorbed into nature by a process of being dissolved, and that the human form of being dissolved back into nature is to commit oneself to the participation of just nature in its own process. To take ourselves back into nature and not let anything interfere with our just being in nature and let nature dissolve us, so that our participation with it is fresh and we're refreshed. And out of that will come a new sense of body, a new sense of existence. It's as simple as somebody like Thoreau going back to the wilderness and saying, after a couple of weeks in the wilderness, when I come back into town, into Concord, I am a completely different person from what I was. And I can do this many times. And when I do this many times, I realized that, Thoreau is saying, I realized that I have an indefinite number of rings of growth, just like a tree would have, and I can become really very, very large. But that it takes time, and it also takes courage, because you can't be afraid to go back into nature and just be there. Just like the mind cannot be afraid of enriched experience and be dissolved by it, that what gets in the way of both of those is a fear of freedom. That you may not make it back out again. Well, what's going to happen to you then? Well, you'll be gone. Right. You'll be dissolved. You will, in fact, because the mind has a specific form of the fear of freedom, it thinks it will go insane. It will go crazy. It will go mad. Because the enriched experience is enriched in such a way that it isn't formed any longer by the structure of your mind. It's just this wild swirl. And because it's much more enriched, the swirls are like big waves now. They're rough seas. And if you commit yourself to that, you're going to be tossed increasingly at some point into madness rather than into a better formed mind. That your sophistication will carry you to over the edge into irrationality. When Whitehead got to that point in his development, he realized that this had already been discussed 2,400 years ago by Plato. And that the place in Plato where it's discussed is a dialogue that we're using along with the Philosophy in a New Key. And Philosophy in a New Key, by the way, is dedicated to her teacher, Alfred North Whitehead, my great teacher and friend. And the Platonic dialogue that we're using with it is the Phaedrus, because that's where in Plato you find in several different little episodes in the dialogue exactly where Plato puts the finger on all of these issues when they originally occurred. It was the first time they ever occurred. And it isn't because Plato was just this genius who first saw it. He saw it because his teacher taught him. Socrates saw it before Plato. But Socrates was not the first to see it. He saw it because he had a teacher named Diotima, and she taught him. That before Diotima taught him how to be real, he had no idea himself. And that Diotima got it directly from Pythagoras, who was the great genius, and he didn't originate it. He got it because he studied in ancient Egypt for 22 years and then studied in Iran for another 11 years. And after 33 years of studying the ancient wisdom traditions that went back thousands of years, by the time of Pythagoras, Egyptian civilization was already 2,500 years old. So the origins of Egyptian symbolism were as old to Pythagoras as Pythagoras is to us. He's only midway back. But the ancient Egyptian civilization that has its hieroglyphs that are there, those hieroglyphs are very ancient and go back, we know now that they go back to almost 40,000 years. And that the original way in which the symbolic mind gained its structure, its power, was because of Paleolithic cave art. And it is the pictures on the Paleolithic caves that are the origins of written symbols and the beginnings of what we would today call the intelligent mind. And when you go to Paleolithic cave art, and we now are in possession with several dozens of major caves, some of them discovered just in the last 10 years. Two of the most ancient caves were discovered in the late 1990s in southern France. One of them is a cave that's under several hundred feet of water now, but 40,000 years ago, the level of the Mediterranean was lower, and that cave was on dry land. And the peculiar thing is that cave is only 5 miles from the entrance to Marseille's harbor, one of the biggest shipping harbors in the world. And you've got hundreds of industrial ships crossing over where this cave's entrance was a couple of hundred feet down. And it was only found because some French military divers were checking for things down on the Mediterranean floor, and they found an opening, and it was an extremely dangerous thing. The opening went over 400 feet through muddy water, some couple hundred feet down, and several French Navy divers lost their lives. But when they finally got through, they resurfaced and they came up into a dry cave that had not been seen by man for over 25,000 years. And there were some of the most pristine and most ancient Paleolithic cave art ever known. The cave is called Cosquer. And within a couple of years, another one at Chauvet was found. It also went back almost 35,000 BC. These caves show, even at that origin, almost 40,000 years ago, that there are not little squiggly, childish diagrams of animals. They are already refined. The art is art. It's not squiggles. And what is presented is not just some kind of sketching melee confusion, but the pictures in the earliest caves are arranged in sequences that one would visit them in these groups in this sequence. And that as you would visit them in these groups in this sequence, you would build up a pictorial imagery in your experience that when it was gelled as a gestalt, an idea would form for the first time in a mental space. And the idea was that man could penetrate through the limitations of himself into a transcendental otherness. That he was not limited to this body, not limited to this life, not limited to just even this species, but that all of those forms could be penetrated and that one could go beyond. And that if you went beyond, there was a completely different realm. That was the real basis of this world, the real basis of oneself. And so the realization was there 40,000 years ago. We must make gestalts of images and rituals of visiting so that all together they make this kind of a gestalt where it allows us to get the idea of life eternal, of resurrection, of rebirth. And that when one does that, there is a peculiar thing that happens. You don't experience that it happens to you now for the first time, but you experience that you always knew this. That deeper than your mind is the sense that you were of this reality forever, and that this was your real home. That this mind, this life, is like an episode that repeats and repeats world without end. And that it's valuable because it's finiteness, but that reality has this extraordinary other eternal quality. So the whole understanding of symbols was challenged. It isn't just that the mind, when it's formed, is limited, but within the interior space of those limits is a transformational possibility. And what one transforms with there is consciousness. Consciousness. And that the carrier of consciousness is remembering. But when remembering comes into the mind, it gets into the mind in a very special way. The center of the imagery, the center of the pictorialness is the imagination. And it's the imagination that penetrates into the new horizon of vision And it is one of the flows of that horizon of vision, remembering, that now comes into the mind and occupies the center that the imagination had. So now the symbolic mind has memory, the memory, and one's vision has a creative imagination, out of which will come art. So that there is this do-si-do of centers. One a center of a form, the other the kind of thread of a flow. And they exchange and take each other's place. And out of this comes literally a new man in a new life, capable of a completely new world. Let's take a little break. Let's come back. We're appreciating something that is of enormous significance, and for the last 2,500 years has been a problem with all social forms, from the individual trying to establish a relationship with another individual, all the way up to civilization. All of the levels of cultural flow and of social forms are bedeviled by this particular conundrum. It resurfaces again and again in many forms as a flaw. So that when forms are made by the mind, whether they're forms of one's individuality or forms of one's relationships, a marriage, a relationality, a family, all the way through the different levels of community. This particular set of flaws is almost split in such a way that they behave as opposites. The ancient time-honored way of overcoming it originally was not through our particular choices of the modern age, but the ancient way of coming through it, that you had to have some kind of an energy that drew you all the way through the levels of the natural cycle, drew you completely through in such a way that you were willing to give up the center of yourself to another. And of course, the ancient way in which this was talked about was love. That the energy of love saves one from being egotistically bound up only in yourself, and that when you have a beloved, they are more important to you than you are to yourself. If it is a beloved, if it is a child, that the willingness to achieve the maturity of being an individual includes not just the option, but includes the energy to go beyond oneself in giving oneself to the other. Well, this has, of course, its humorous aspect in Crocodile Dundee. When Paul Hogan is taking a bath, he's humming to himself, and he says, "If I give my heart to you, I'll have none and you'll have two." If love is not reciprocal, then it can end up that way. And that one then becomes slavishly bound to another who is not just with you, but is an other, and so there's an alienation quality that's involved in the whole thing. So that the very quality that would lead to a maturity beyond your natural limitations into a whole other magical realm used to be called in ancient Greece by Plato, used to be called a fine madness. And that this fine madness not only was love, but as it pulled one through, there were different ways in which it was expressed. That there could be the madness of a grand passion of love, but there could also be the madness that one would become prophetic, like the oracle at Delphi, or the oracles of Zeus at Dodona, or the Sibyl at Cumae near Naples in southern Italy. There was also the madness of the poet, of the artist. And that all of these are fine madnesses, but there is also the danger of an irrationality that will creep in, and that one doesn't give oneself to that fine madness, in which case, Plato says in the Phaedrus, these fine madnesses are gifts of the divine to man. They're gifts of God to man. And one needs not to look a gift horse in the mouth. You need to accept those gifts, accept the love, accept the poetic, accept the fine madness, in the sense that participation by the body in nature allows it to be reabsorbed in nature. Participation by the mind in an enriched experience is reabsorbed. But this happens that the center of the mind, called the soul in translation, is reabsorbed into the divine outside of the limits of nature. And Socrates, who learned about this way from Diotima, alludes to it in the Phaedrus, but the in-depth presentation of it is in the dialogue that goes with the Phaedrus called the Symposium, the original Symposium. I have put here this was my series on Plato in 1990. I did 27 90-minute lectures on all of Plato's dialogues and made notes on all of them so that somebody could just literally, page by page, step by step, word by word, phrase by phrase, see how this works. These are my Paleolithic cave paintings on paper. And the illustration here is from a very ancient labyrinth. And this labyrinth is placed in the center of the floor of Chartres Cathedral. That center where the nave and the long transept come together, at that center of the cross of Chartres Cathedral is where this maze is put. And it is a specific kind of a maze. In order to get to the center of this maze, you must cover the entire field of the labyrinth. Your steps in following the maze will go in a kind of a seesaw back and forth, but not just a back and forth of two, but a back and forth, an entanglement of 4 quarters of the circle in such a way that by the time you get to the center, you will have traversed the entire field of the labyrinth, which in that case will no longer be a maze, but will be a context of mystery, which you will have mastered as an initiation. Now, there were many ways which Chartres was built and rebuilt in the 1100s. It took more than a generation to build it originally, and when Chartres was finished, There was a disastrous fire within a couple of years, and the whole thing had to be rebuilt again. It took 2 more generations. This relentless dedication of hundreds of workmen, of tens of thousands of people whose support of these generations of masons and constructors and architects to make Chartres is an extraordinary adventure, and it goes all the way back to the Paleolithic Cave Art. It goes all the way back to the interiors of the Great Pyramids. It goes all the way back into the way in which temples have been made always, and that symbolic architecture has a very interesting way of projecting itself in a supra-mental flow into what traditionally is called a spiritual space, a sacred space. That sacred space can only be projected from the completeness of the natural cycle, but when it is projected from the completeness, its spherical, dimensional, solid form in spiritual space has a different quality to it. It becomes a work of art. That this is what art is, and the art for us is to transcend our individuality and become a multifaceted, kaleidoscopic personality. A personality now that has the ability to be mobile in spiritual space and not be limited by the space of the natural world. So that one is able now, as Plato says in the Phaedrus, one is able to utilize something that we had originally, eternally, and somehow lost, and now have regained. And what it is, he says, we can't say it exactly in words, but we can tell in a mythic image that it's like wings. It's like the soul getting its wings back. That it had lost its wings. That souls originally, in reality, always have wings, so to speak, and that they lose them. And when they lose them, here's an illustration from Aristotle's On the Soul, and it has the classic way in which Plato in the Phaedrus has Socrates tell an ancient myth that has a symbolic integral and has a conscious projection into a spiritual space. And he says the image in that mythic horizon comes from the chariot. And that there is a charioteer, an inner charioteer to ourselves. And that this chariot in man's world has the pair of horses, but the horses are opposites. One of the horses, he says, is a very noble, wants to be noble, has fine breeding, elegant. The other is a completely opposite. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And that the difficulty is to get them to work together so that you can go somewhere. Because their tendencies is to go in opposite ways. One would like to go, the other would like to stop. Or the other would like to be cautious, the other wants to just run ahead. So that they're opposite in every sort of a way. And Socrates says that to Phaedrus, they're talking just one-on-one, and it's the only dialogue in Plato where Socrates goes out of the city. It's the only one that he steps out of town. And he and Phaedrus go along, there are 2 rivers in Athens, and the Ilissus is on the northern bounds. It's now within Athens. Athens is several million people now. In those days, it was about 200,000. And so he's talking with Phaedrus, and the reason that they've gone out of the city, Socrates has only gone out of the city once in his whole life when he served military service. And he was very courageous. He was commended. He was wounded. But since then, he has not left the city. And this is the only time that he takes an afternoon off to go outside, because the discussion that he has is a discussion of going outside of all of the limits of civilization and all of the limits of the mind. And so the setting is perfect for what Plato is going to convey, and that is Socrates is trying to alert Phaedrus that there are mysteries involved here, but that the mysteries are not confusion. They're not mysteries because of not knowing. They're mysteries because one does know, but one sees in a completely different way. And one can understand because the biggest swath of Greek religion was not about philosophy. That was limited to several hundred sophisticated men, largely. There were very few women. But by far, 98% of the Greek population practiced Greek mystery religions. And in the Greek mystery religions, one of the most powerful of the Greek mystery religions was at Eleusis. It's about 25 miles outside of what Athens was at the time, the Eleusinian Mysteries. The Eleusinian Mysteries of Demeter and Persephone, of the mother-daughter. Because, Plato says in here, he learned this from Diotima, wisdom is carried by the female. Sophia is feminine. And in every civilization, every culture, the carrier of wisdom is a woman. So that she says in the Symposium to Socrates, when Plato is revealing that Socrates came up against the limits of what he understood and knew, and Diotima was cautioning him and saying, now Socrates, let me put it more clearly, she said. All men are pregnant, Socrates, both in body and in soul. Men become pregnant too. Don't be deceived by the ordinary ritual apparentness. Men become pregnant just like women. You have to understand this, she's saying to Socrates. On reaching a certain age in our nature yearns to beget. But it can only beget by an in-depth entanglement with another. You can't beget by yourself. Doesn't work that way. So that it is the secret exchange of selves that makes it even practical on the physiological basis, but especially deeper on the vital basis, but especially deeper on the symbolic basis, that this is the only way that it actually happens. So that there is the word that Plato uses, the classical Greek word, there's a technique. And techne, in classical Greek, meant both craft and skill and art, out of what we get the word technology. But we also get the word technique. That it is technical, but there's a technique to the technicality of it. And there's a technicality to the technique. So the art has both theory and practice, as you would say, and that you have to get them synergetically. And if your senses of theory and practice are commandeered by the opposites of these two horses, you're never going to get that they are together synergetically. Because if they're together in that synergy, one then has achieved the wings, And the charioteer now has horses that have wings and can fly up through spiritual space. And because it's a spiritual space, it's not limited to natural space. It's able to go to the rims of the spherical universe. And that when one gets to the rim of the spiritual universe, if you have the capacity to penetrate through the bubble rim of the sphere of the universe, your head will go outside of it. And you'll be able to see what's outside for the first time. And Diotima has told him in ancient times there were people who could go completely outside of it, so that they were in their spiritual selves standing on the outside of the sphere of the universe and looking out. And what they saw was God's love for us that creates the reality in the first place. And that in that God's love, there is a yearning to be with us. And that we recognize that we are beloved. That we are a beloved for the divine. And that we also love the divine. It's not a possession to have. It's not commandeering. It's not doing anything other than being in love together. That God and man have that relationship. But it's only apparent in reality on the outside of the universe as one comes back into the sphere of the universe. The various complications of physicality and of mentality and the limits of experience come back into play, and one is more or less now not able to see it all that clearly. Those who can still remember what and how they saw outside come back and they have different eyes. The first time that one finds those eyes are in the late Paleolithic art that came into the Neolithic about 11,000 years ago, about 9,000 BC. And the first time that you find those eyes, you find that they are the eyes of an owl woman. She will have huge, enormous owl eyes, and when you first see them, you don't see a face, you see the eyes, and the eyes look like an infinity sign. It's very huge. They're eyes that see, but they don't see in a focus to the specific outside. They see within, and the inner seeing is allness. Not only allness on the basis of completion, but allness on the projected sphericality, the trigonometric dimensions of perfection, so that they see wholeness and perfection at the same time. Later on, the Greek word in Plato's time, in Pythagoras and Plato's time, was epoptai. It meant being able to see in this special way. And one finds then statues of figures, even back to ancient Sumer. One finds the seer, that's how seer gets into the language, one who can see in this way. And you find statues of men whose long gowns have floral designs in double surroundings, and they're like clover leaf flowers, and their eyes are huge. They are men who have learned to see because they have been initiated by a wise woman. So, Diotima, Socrates telling people at this symposium, and in the symposium it isn't just one person, but it's a number of extraordinary figures in Athens. One of the most brilliant judges and generals of the day was named Alcibiades, but he was so brilliant he thought he could get away with anything, and he shifted sides during the long Peloponnesian War at one point and became the top general for the other side, And then he got tired of that and wanted to see if he could make it back and became the top general again for the original side. So here's Alcibiades, the great comic playwright, dramatist Aristophanes is here. So it's packed. It's a room full of incredible characters, and Socrates is telling all of these men that he is able to see because a Pythagorean woman initiated him into the secrets of love. Not by love-making, but by leading him through the limitations of himself and of his life. And so he got it that all of the brilliance of form that he had symbolically was completely transformed once he was able to go past it. And that when he came back into his mind, he came back in such a way that he understood that the completeness was incomplete. And that's why it didn't project perfection. So he incorporated a genius solution for himself. He said, the one thing that I am sure of is that I don't know. And so a kind of a Socratic ignorance came into play. That you know that you don't know, and so that knowing that you don't know completes what you do know in your mind so that you can have that transformational penetration. So that admitting that you don't know is tantamount to completing whatever it is that you know into enough completion that you're able then to transform. The confession, not of having done something wrong, but the confession of ignorance. I just don't know. And with that, the secret trigger is pulled and you're free to go. But there are levels, like anything, degrees of admitting ignorance, and the more complex you make the mind, the more your ignorance grows and the more difficult it is to confess that, well, there's a lot I don't know. And that a certain sophistication, when one is really refined, you begin to get the insight that you don't know most of it. That all that you really know is a little wedge that in 70 or 80 years of struggle as a man or a woman that you've been able to get this sliver. And so the ignorance that you have to admit is enormous. And that what then is difficult is not the fear of freedom so much, but the fear of ridicule, of self-ridicule, that you really are that dumb. You really are that limited. But the admission of it does the same thing. It gives you the completeness, the opportunity to regrow the wings and to reascend, so that the ascent now is possible. All of this, Socrates says, came as a shock to him. And in the symposium, he says, well, if a person is big and teeming ripe, he feels himself in a sore flutter for the beautiful, because its possessor can relieve him of his heavy pangs. For you are wrong, Socrates, in supposing that love is of the beautiful. And so in his report he said, I said to Diotima, what then is it? And she replies, it is of engendering and begetting upon the beautiful. Be it so, I said. To be sure it is, she went on. And of how engendering, because this is something ever existent and immortal in our mortal life. It's a bit of eternity that comes into play within our mortal life. Where the soul was the focus of a symbolic mind, it has exchanged places with a bit of eternity, so that what is there now at the center of the mind is a bit of eternity. And one's soul has gone on to exchange with the other as in the eternal. She says to him, from what has been admitted, we must needs then yearn for immortality no less than for good, since love loves good to be one's own forever, and hence it necessarily follows that love is of immortality. He said, all this instruction I got from her at various times, and one is to understand that she didn't just speak with him once, but that she, again and again, like a good Pythagorean, put him through the paces of going through a cycle. And we've talked about how the Pythagorean cycle had two main waves. The first wave was silence, of learning how to listen. And they were called acousmatiki, from acoustics, acousmatic. One has to learn how to listen. Not to speak, but to listen. And that this happens before one is able to read. That symbolic forms are forms that come out of experience, and the one quality of experience that's necessary is having learned how to listen, learned how to hear. So that the images and the feelings and the language come together in a quietness. Wittgenstein's silence. At the end of the Tractatus, remember number 7, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Not silent because there's nothing to say, but silent because you have to learn again. You have to learn to hear again deeper, a deeper quality, deeper notes, higher notes, farther ranging notes. One of the deepest qualities of Wittgenstein was his ability to appreciate music, and in the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus at its center is all about the mysteriousness of how a conductor will take a musical score and be able to produce the symphony out of it. He's not just reading the symbols on the score, but he's able to project that score out in gestures, in the training of the orchestra, and produce the symphony. Say, one of the most triumphant symphonies of that age and day was Brahms' Fourth Symphony, which the themes and handling in the Fourth Symphony are one of the grandest, triumphant, emergent marches in classical music. It's an incredible thing. Wittgenstein heard Brahms conduct the Fourth Symphony personally in his Vienna, understood these kinds of things. He says in the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, and we'll go into it just a little more next week because we're going into it in licks, in phases, in resonances, because this is how the ancient wisdom was always taught. You can't go directly to it because if you do, you develop a linearity that trusts geometricity that doesn't lift off the page. It stays in the diagram. It stays on the graph. So that you only trust a statistical form of the graphability, and you don't trust the farther ranges of transformed spirit. You don't even assume that they're possible, that they're there, that this belongs somehow to the childhood of men. Now we're all grown up. The Victorian saying at the time that all these people were at Cambridge, the Victorians said of themselves, primitive people are subject to evolution, but not us. We have crawled ashore from the ocean of development, and we have arrived. We have it made. And of course, the First World War showed that they had made a dead end They had achieved a dead end. This is a portrait by Gustav Klimt of one of Wittgenstein's sisters, Gretel, one of the most famous and wealthy beauties of the day. Gustav Klimt is one of the great artists of the day. When she got married, she contracted a German architect to build her a beautiful house in Vienna, one of the best districts. And her brother, Ludwig Wittgenstein, started looking over the shoulder of this architect and said, well, I've built a cabin. I know a little bit about architecture. And as he got into it, he applied his enormous genius and relentlessness, and he started making changes in the architect's plans until finally the house turned out to be his architecture and not Engelmann's architecture. And so the house that Wittgenstein built for his sister in Vienna became one of the most famous modern architecture houses, a kind of a Le Corbusier style house before Le Corbusier did his things. Here's the facade. And the inside is just as clean, just as purified, just as geometric. And you have to understand that this house, built in the early 1920s, is a complete rejection of the crowded, sumptuous European palatial houses that had been around since Roman times. That this house is going to be the combing clean. It's the logical philosophicus of architecture. We want to have homes that are cleaned of all of this confused opposites swirling around and warring with each other, and we want to have a home environment which is like the calm, clear, clean mind that allows for our lives to achieve not just a geometricity, but to achieve something which geometry, when it lifts off the page, is no longer plain geometry, but is solid geometry. And in the solid geometry, it isn't just the sphere, but there were 5 solid forms. They're called the Pythagorean solids, or the Platonic solids, one of which is a pyramid, one of which is a cube, one of which is a sphere. And one finds that this is like a universal quality from Ireland to India. When you look at the Buddhist stupas in India, you see at the top of the dome, you see the 5 solids arranged in that kind of aerial cupola at the top. That's the architectural form of the artist standing outside of the bubble of the universe and standing in the divine spiritual space and bringing that energy through these solids in their order like an energy condenser, so that the inside of that stupa is energized and that the energy is recollected in the inside of that stupa by its focus. And because its focus is there in phenomenal space, in the architecture, interpenetrated by a spiritual transcendent space, anyone who occupies that double focus will get that penetration there and then. So that the entire sense here, you see that form in India, but you also see that form in ancient Ireland. One of the earliest temples in Paleolithic Ireland is called Lagrange. And Lagrange is exactly like a Buddhist stupa made thousands of years before. And there are several still surviving. That entire form is like the architecture of the skull, like our cranium, like the seat of our physiological brain, of our mind. And The only way in which symbols are able to function outside of that is that they gain a transparency. Not just the mythic thing of wings, but the transparency so that one can see through them. That they are not opaque so that all that you see are the mirror surfaces of your own limitations of your mind. But that you learn to see through them. Then the eyes become the windows of the soul. Then what they see is not just what is physically there or vitally happening or symbolically structured, but one sees like an artist sees. One sees the possibilities of what it could be as well. More next week.